sort of surface that defined the shape of this town, and that's why the tagline for the podcast is the magic and mystery of place. I really wanted to understand how this place, in particular, physically, this place has affected the people that live here, but in the same way, how the people that live here have sort of shaped the identity of the place. Reading von Forster and his declaration of second order cybernetics, this idea of, a system of, a person or an observer observing an action, and then that creating a system, but then another loop where the system is aware that there's an observer observing that event, and it keeps feeding back.
Welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore folklore, magic, the world of the spirits, and everything in between. What does the Karst landscape, the Kentucky anomaly, a meat shower, and a mysterious cult have in common? Well, we're going to find out today. They are linked by the strange and unexplained activity originating from the Pennyroyal Plateau in Kentucky, and the subject matter of the superb Pennyroyal podcast. For episode 75, we're joined by the creator and host of the Pennyroyal podcast, Nathan Isaac, as he takes us through the remarkable story he and his colleagues uncovered as they created the show. In the Plus show, we go through the spook element in the area, and we also go through what's coming up in season 2, and you really don't want to miss that. Some really, really interesting stuff. Now, if you'd like to hear the Plus show, then do sign up for the Patreon for the extended show and a host of other benefits. Now, before we start, as is tradition, a big thank you to the ANC patron members. In no particular order, Icaro, William O, Robert W, Roland B, Steph, Tim, Tao, Wei, Pamela, Michelle, Merrily, Marco, Jen, Hannah, Flora, Eric, Desiree, Alston, Ali, Carrie S, Brennan, Tyler, Madeline, Jorge, and Tony. Thank you all so much for your support. Without it, I really couldn't do this. If you'd like to support the show, but Patreon isn't your thing, then you can buy me a coffee via link in the show notes, or you can give me a positive review, as every 5-star rating helps. As you know, I'm always interested in people's experiences or recommendations for guests, so do reach out to me if you've got a story to tell or somebody you think you should come on the show. Right, that's it from me. It's time to go to Kentucky. Nathan Isaac, you're very, very welcome to the Spirit Box.
Thank you for having me on. I'm very, very excited to chat tonight. So.
Well, really cool to have you on. For those who don't know out there, you're the host and the creator of the Pennyroyal podcast, which is really, really extraordinary. It's I mean, from a podcasting perspective, a wonderfully produced one, really well put together. From a listener perspective, is deeply intriguing and hugely engaging. So I'm delighted to have you on the show, and really to get things moving. If you could give just the audience a kind of a topographical view of Pennyroyal.
Yeah. Again, thanks for having me on. Very excited to talk to you about this.
Awesome.
But I'm the host and writer producer of Pennyroyal. Got a couple of friends who and partners in crime that I produce the show with. One of whom runs the Paranormal Museum here in Somerset, which is interesting that the town has its own museum, but that's Kyle Cadell. And then Darian West is my partner on a lot of projects that involve programming, data mining, a lot of stuff like that. So, but the three of us started working on this together. I kind of began the project probably 3 years ago, a little bit over 3 years ago, when I started looking into strange things have been happening here for a long time, but I really started looking into some murders that had happened here, some very famous murders back in 1994 that had some strange circumstances. And the deeper that I kind of went, in that direction, the more that I found it was a lot of strange events that started to stack together. And And really the project was about collecting folklore. Originally it was these stories about these murders, but I was really curious why, because what I discovered was that the story I was hearing, the story that had become so famous, was actually a mixture of separate stories. And so, and then, once you start collecting local folklore, you just start to hear more and more strange stories. Everybody's got some story to tell you. And so it became this sort of, I think topography is a great way to put it. This sort of surface that defined the shape of this town, and that's why the tagline for the podcast is the magic and mystery of place. I really wanted to understand how this place, in particular, physically, this place has affected the people that live here, but in the same way, how the people that live here have sort of shaped the identity of the place. And so once we got deeper into it, I broke the rule. A friend of mine is a folklorist, PhD folklorist, and she appears in the second season that's coming up. But I interviewed her about this because I just wanted to talk about the theory of folklore, and because I'm not a professional folklorist, but obviously an amateur folklorist, and she said, I broke the rules by becoming part of the story, and I guess that was the strangest thing about all of this was how the more that we got into it and the stranger that this got, the more that it was such a deeply personal story and very much affected by our observation of the story. I think that's the most interesting thing, but it's just it's a hard thing to describe, but ultimately it's a story about this place and this town and this region, and all of the strange things that we've sort of found, this web work of high strangeness.
It's quite a remarkable array of high strangeness. I mean, it really is. I mean, there's not a lot that doesn't come up throughout the narrative over the first series. I mean, some really remarkable stuff. And one of the things that really drew me to the show was obviously there's kind of the buzz around it and kind of recommendations from like our mutual friend Marco Visconti was talking about on his Discord. But one of the things that really interested me about it when you were talking about kind of like the actual geography of the place, the fact that it's a karst landscape, the fact there's a high quartz content in the area, and it's really interesting when you were talking about that, because that's kind of associated with fairies as well. Like the high kind of quartz content in stone, it tends to kind of, you tend to get a lot of like fairy activity in that kind of place. And similarly, a guest who was on the show a couple of weeks back, Michelle DeVrezes, has done an awful lot of research into the 411 phenomenon, and she's mapping it against topography and seeing kind of geological correlations to where these things cluster. So it's just, it's remarkable that there's that kind of geographical element to it. And then obviously there's all the layers of mystery on top. So in terms of the overall kind of areas that you've explored, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was, what was we'll get into kind of some of the broad stories of the podcast, but what I wanted to ask you was, what was the biggest kind of like jaw-dropping, like holy shit moment for you while doing the interviews and putting all the different shows together?
Definitely the Guterma stuff. There was a moment, if anybody's familiar with the show, in the third episode, we interview a woman named Pamela about her experiences with what she alleges to be a cult that was operating here in town. And I guess that's to me was probably one of the most intriguing things, was that all these people kept saying cult. There's a cult, and this is the Bible Belt. And for a lot of people, that's devil worshippers, right? And so, I've grown up hearing stories like that. I'm not from here in Somerset originally. I'm from Eastern Kentucky in the mountains, but my wife's family's from here, and we moved here. And so, for me as an outsider, it's been interesting digging into all this. But I kept hearing these stories of the cult, and I was like, I don't think there's a cult here. These people are probably misinterpreting this. And so I was put in touch with Pamela to talk to her about her cult experiences. And when she told me the stories, definitely she has suffered some type of trauma, which is absolutely true. And I'm not saying that she didn't have the experiences, but some of it definitely lines up with what would be considered, the satanic ritual abuse, right? Sort of formula in a sense, but again, that's not to say it's not true, but when I was interviewing her, I was like, man, this is, it was definitely ethically as someone trying to collect folklore and just to do the podcast and tell these stories. I think that was sort of one of the interviews that I really was like, I really want to handle this with a lot of care. I want to be respectful of who she is and what has happened to her. So ultimately, though, we finished that interview, and I was like, okay, still was on the fence about some of this stuff. And then after the Hellier guys, after Greg and his crew came through and we sort of intersected with them, and they told me that they'd interviewed another woman, a separate woman who had stories of some type of cult. I was kind of like, man, is there really something to this? We're finding multiple people. And then, I had Kyle was the one that knew Pamela. She actually has a nonprofit that she runs for ritual abuse victims, and that was another sort of interesting aspect of it. But, I told Kyle, I was like, ask her really, where was all of this happening? Where was this happening at? And so he contacted her again and said, hey, can you give us some definite places? And she said the Mount Victory Mine. And so, he calls me, tells me that. I immediately get online and, and mind you, she's telling us and other people are telling us that there's this international cult of people flying into Somerset multiple times throughout the year to do these rituals, and then she says at the Mount Victory Mine. Well, so when I Google Mount Victory Mine and Somerset, because when she said that, I was like, there are no mines here. We're a little bit too far west for coal mines, right? And I was like, there's no way that there's a coal mine here. And I even asked a few people, and they were like, no, there's no coal mine here. Definitely not up in the Mount Victory area. But when I searched for that, the first thing that comes up on Google, immediately, is a newspaper article about Alexander Gaterma, which the New York Times referred to as Mr. X, because no one knew this guy's past. He said he was this Russian exile who grew up in the Philippines. He ends up in the U.S. But reading this article, immediately it's like the guy was involved in the largest stock heist, stock manipulation in U.S. history by 1959. He came here in 1951. He had ties to the JFK assassination. He also was involved in the overthrow of the Dominican Republic. They charged him, the U.S. government charged him with that. Just this kind of person that, he owned the Desert Inn, which was in Las Vegas where Frank Sinatra played for the first time, right? And so it's like all of these crazy stories about this guy that I thought I should have heard about this guy, right? And that was sort of the point of the New York Times article, that he really was a Mr. X. And then you read the article, and in 1975, he moved his entire financial empire to Somerset, Kentucky, and bought the Mount Victory Mine. Wow. And he was living in another place, but he was spending all of his time there, and even moved his family up here. And he was here from 1975 to 1977. And then in 77, he was flying from Boca Raton from another house they have in Florida, and then diverted the plane to Somerset. They were on their way to the circus at Madison Square Gardens in New York City, and he diverted the plane, landed in Somerset. They took off, and then the plane crashed in Brooklyn and killed him and his entire family, except for one child. That child died 8 years later in another plane crash, which is crazy. But it was one of those things where I have this, all of these stories about this group and these things happening in this town. And then this woman tells me that it was happening in this place, right? Mm-hmm. And then when I look at that place, it turns out it is involved, not necessarily with a cult, but with an individual who is, for all intents and purposes, I mean, this guy read like a Bond villain, Right. I mean, it's this international man of mystery. And I was like, what is this? Right. And then on top of that, we dig a little further and, we looked up everything on this guy, and I ended up I told Darian, I was like, I don't think we can find any more. I think this is it. Let's move on. And that night, Darian messaged me and he was like, man, I found an article. He bought the mine from Vice President Spiro Agnew. So I dig into that and we find out that this, was this attorney named Lester Burns, who we talk about in the series, that they wrote a book about because he was involved in a high-profile murder. But his business partner was Vice President Spiro Agnew, and they had used funds from the Nixon re-election campaign to buy this mine, which then they sold to this Alexander Gaterma, this Mr. X. And I was telling Darian, I was like, this is incredible because, you think of Somerset as this town in southern Kentucky, but all of these international figures are suddenly involved with this mine that these people are telling us that there are strange things happening at. And for me, that was really what made me start to take it a little more seriously, I still don't think there was a cult or anything, but the way that all of this has sort of fallen together, it does make you realize that there is a pattern to it and there is an underlying framework, even if the things aren't connected directly, right? There are too many things for it to be coincidence. And in a sense, that's what the project has become. And that's what, Pennyroyal, the story became, was us trying to understand the constellation of strangeness that was focused here and why. Why it was that way. So that for me was the moment when I was like, Jesus, what the fuck's going on here?
I can imagine. I sort of envisage, one of those classic, like detective walls of just like photographs with threads and pins, just kind of overlaying a map. So in terms of that, you've got you've got the mine, you've got the cave complex, and obviously there's kind of there's an overlay with Hellier there as well. There's the Hobbsville Goblin, all the stories, all that kind of stuff. Pulling those threads and finding all these kind of different stuff come up, and some stuff as you didn't expect, as you've just gone over. With the side of the kind of the paranormal side of things, where do you fall on that now? What's your sense of it, or has it pushed your own boundaries of what you think is possible, what you think is happening at all? Have you changed in that light?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, I've always had a fascination with, like high strangeness, and, I've always been a big fan of, John Keel, and, I read a lot of, Charles Fort, Book of the Damned, and so, I collected a lot of stories like that. So I've always been open to the possibility of high strangeness. I think in terms of my, the fascination with like UFOs or Bigfoot or even ghosts or, looking into stuff like that, I love all of those stories. But I think for me, the more that I've been involved with this and the more I've engaged with it, the more that that I really do believe in, how to put it, a layer of reality or a layer of knowing, that is sort of on top of all of this, that whether to say it's deeper or above or below or what, it's hard to define it that way. And a lot of this too, it's hard to define it in it's also ineffable in a way too, but I have shifted, my belief in all this has shifted to knowing that there is something that connects all of these things together. I don't think that the UFO sightings or, the anomalous lights, the things that people have been seeing here, reporting here, stories of dogmen, even the story, definitely the stories of like Black Panthers, alien big cats, stuff like that, that those things are not separate from one another, that they are part of some type of phenomena, that that exists. And I guess in that way, all of this has cemented in my mind that there is some unseen quality to our existence that makes that allows those things to exist. And so understanding how we in this existence interface with those things, I think is really, that's where my focus has shifted, and a lot of it involves, and then we get into it in the 8th episode, the final episode, but a lot of it really involves this idea of cybernetics, and not in a purely mechanical or technological sense, but this idea of feedback loops, of systems. And that, before researching all this, I'd never heard of second order cybernetics. I just wasn't familiar with it. And, the idea of the Macy conferences came up through a researcher, Stephen Snyder. And he mentioned it to us, and it was connected to something else, somebody else that we found. And I started looking at the Macy conferences and reading von Forster and his declaration of second order cybernetics, this idea of, a system of, a person or an observer observing an action, and then that creating a system, but then another loop where the system is aware that there's an observer observing that event, and it keeps feeding back, right? And so much of this involves coincidence, synchronicities. You get into the whole James Shelby Downard and synchromysticism, right? And the more that I've looked at this stuff, the more that it feels like synchronicities and these meaningful coincidences are sort of these second order cybernetic systems that begin to feed upon, what I'm saying? Like the more that you focus on it, the more that it grows, right? And if you don't, we probably experience this thousands of times a day, right? But certain things that we focus on our observational, sort of qualities on, and feed into it, they feed back, and then they get bigger and bigger. You get into the concept of egregores and tulpas, and those things, if you read the literature, what they're describing is it's almost like a version of spiritual 3D printing, but it involves, each layer involves it coming back on you and you laying down another layer. And so I think a lot of these things, a lot of these people I interview, a lot of these, these things that are happening, they have those qualities, the information system. And for me, a lot of my concept of how this works, and in no way am I saying this is definitive, or that this is definitely what this is, but it has shifted for me so that anytime I'm looking at this or listening to a story or interviewing a new person, I'm sort of looking at it also from that angle. And for me, I think the paranormal, the supernatural, high strangeness, there's something about information and observation that is absolutely essential to whatever's happening,
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never heard it described in that way before. But it's interesting in terms of if I understand you correctly, like there's an underlying kind of idea of there's a relationship between the observer and the observed. When you get into the whole kind of quantum physics ideas there in terms of how electrons behave in different ways, like a liquid and a solid, depending on the test that they're given, that they're responding to something. I think the question is, or the really interesting angle is there a consciousness? Is there an intelligence?
Yeah.
Behind it?
And that's the thing too. You hear this a lot, obviously the Hellier team, Greg and Dana and those folks, they often talk about the phenomena, and I think that's become sort of a common way in this community now to refer to it or whatever, things that are happening that as the phenomena, and that the way that it's spoken of indicates that there's some consciousness behind it, now, whether or not that's a single consciousness or something, I think that's where we all are with this. I don't think that there's one thing creating all of these separate phenomena, right? But as a class of, taken together as an aggregate of reality, as a, plethora of phenomena. I mean, there definitely is, undeniably, there's an element of the observer. It's the whole, once you start looking at the phenomena starts looking back at you, the reflexive nature of it, but also that gets you into this idea of the trickster, right? Because I feel like, and all the famous literature about, I forget what's the guy's name that wrote the book, The Trickster and the, I can't think of it right now. Anyway, it's a well-known book. The trickster can only exist once you start to interact with it, right? It almost takes it could play a trick on you, but not until you really start, like responding to it, and that's the thing too. It's like hauntings as well. Greg Newkirk and I have talked about this before, that, he was telling me that when there's a haunting in someone's house and all these things start happening, that often he tells people to get a new TV, something else to focus on, right? Because the more that you observe it and the more that you feed back into it, the bigger it can get sometimes, right? Yeah. And I think that's how the conversation started that we were talking about, was that when you look at all of this, it's once you start feeding into it, right, it becomes not more powerful, but it'll become more frequent. It's haunted houses that were never really haunted, and then a ghost hunting group goes there, right? Yeah. And then they investigate the place, and then they leave, and then it suddenly
kicks off.
Yeah, explodes, and all kinds of people, and even the experiment where they created the tulpa, I think it was Canadian researchers. What's it called? I forget the guy's name, but they named it. But they created an identity of a ghost in a place that was not haunted, and then they invited ghost hunters there, and it's like after they left, the Philip experiments, right? Okay. And whenever they left, then people reported a haunting. And it's like, is there something to it there where they've invested some level of observation that has allowed this to manifest, right? Yeah. And then it feeds off of observation, and then dies away if it doesn't have it. So I don't know. To me, that's what's been so fruitful, and what's really caused me to dive deeper and deeper into this is exploring these kinds of questions. Yeah.
They're extraordinary questions, that they really are. And then they're really challenging as well, because they're paradigm shattering. I've spoken before with previous guests and about this kind of stuff, that when you have these experiences or indeed revelations, that they are no pun intended, but they're a personal apocalypse of sorts, because life changes. Like, your understanding of what's real and what's not dramatically shifts, and that can be a bumpy road, right? It can be hard to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, that's the it is one of those things where, like, when I'm a storyteller. I love stories. I love to collect stories. And this was one of those things where, like, this crazy story fell in my lap, right? That if I tried to find the story, I would never find it, right? But it landed in my lap, and it's like all of the things that we started to find that seemed so outlandish that it was like sort of difficult to, you got a day job, right? You know what I mean? Like, you got to go to work every day, and you've got to support your family, but then in the background, all of these weird things are bouncing around and becoming part of your life, and then it's like, well, how does this, there are those days when you're at work, and it's, the banality, of it all, and then it's like these bigger questions, these bigger things, and you feel close to something happening, right? I guess that's the magic of it, right? And it's like, it's almost, not to talk about it even in a paranormal sense, but like in a magical sense, it's like, that's a whole other side of it. It's like, suddenly now it feels like the world's saying, you know what, magic really exists,
Yeah.
And not even in a people trying to perform magic sense, but just that, hey man, look at this. This is evidence that there is a magic to reality. There's a magic to existence. You've probably just not been seeing it, but here it is, and you can't unsee it, right? You can't, that here it is, and I think that, the sort of the perpetual mystery of it all is what you kind of are always fighting against, allowing that to swallow you,
Yeah, no, that's really well put. I think very much on the same lines, is that it's very easy to become overwhelmed and to sink into it.
Yeah.
This is where I think magical training is very useful, because it has that practical level of discipline and practice that, for want of a better analogy, is like you're going to the gym, the metaphysical gym, and kind of working the appropriate muscles. I think it gives you a lot of grounding for and defenses for dealing with this kind of thing.
And I was going to say too that I've had a couple of instances where, and we can talk about it some other time, but or I'll send it to you because it is somewhat of a long story. But a few times where it seemed that, not that I was attacked, but that someone or something was interacting with me, and I don't practice magic. I'm not trained in any type of magical practices. And so there were a few times, our research definitely, though, has led us into, looking at groups like the Bait Cabal and others who definitely were here in this area, Nema and others. And obviously they weren't doing anything nefarious. And it turns out a lot of magical groups were coming to this area. And a few times in interacting with this story from that perspective, I've had some negative things happen that seemed directed, right? And which I ended up talking to Marco about right after one of these things happened. I immediately contacted Marco Viscano, and I'm like, "What is this, man? Do you think this is someone used a sigil against me?" And but then that ended up playing out and turning into a really strange set of coincidences, in a broader sense. And so there's such that I think that's why a lot of people that might be investigating, say, UFOs, or you're a Bigfoot guy, or you're a ghost person, right? And then it's like, but then there's magic involved. And so I think for a lot of people, what shatters your sort of perception of all this is, how does magic play into a UFO sighting, right? Yeah. Or a Bigfoot sighting, or, whatever the thing is that they encounter. There are all these, the mixture of the different parts of this phenomena that force you to break down your, preconceptions of what I don't think you should ever, I think that's where people make the mistake, is assuming that it's X, right? As soon as you do that, it's almost like you've lost the ability to see it, like you have to just be open to it's almost like Schrodinger's cat, all of these possibilities, you have to almost, in a sense, not look at any one of them, because if you do, the others collapse. But that doesn't mean the others aren't any less real.
Yeah. Again, really, really well put. I think that's where the trickster bit comes into it, and it's just that famous thing of like, what's behind door A, what's behind door B. It's the same thing with a different face, and behaving in a different way and contradictory ways often, it's such a challenge. It's such a challenge for us to understand, because I think it pushes the limits of our capability, because it's otherworldly, by its very nature. We can't grasp it in its entirety. We can only see glimpses and try to define those glimpses, and it's a mistake. And I think it's this part of it is just kind of giving in to the fact that it's a mystery, and acknowledging the mystery exists.
Yeah, and I think that's how, kind of my view now is that, is that I'm not looking, I'm looking for the mystery, but not looking for the answer to the mystery, right? That because it's like, I in trying to focus on any of these things, I'll find so much, but then it starts to lead me away from the story that's really being told to me, right? And so it's always balancing that of not getting too far away from the voice that is this story, to talk about it that way. I think that's weird too. When I'm talking to people about it, I'm talking about it in the terms of a story. I mean, it is a narrative. I mean, it's really happening, these things continue to play out. I've for the second season, and even right now, I've found all of these crazy things. And then, I've filed all these FOIA requests, find documents, because, so much of this seems so outlandish, but so much of it is documented, especially like the Oakwood stuff,
take us through the Oakwood stuff.
God, man, that was so, find all the stuff about the murders and then the cult stuff. And there's so much esotericism built into this, Pan and things like that, with Dan Dutton, who's a famous artist here in Kentucky, but just a famous American artist. And he and I have had a very close friendship, and there's a certain inherent magic to his life and his work, right? That has been a big part of this story. And so as all of this was, finding it out and it was all sort of layering, we met the Hellier guys, and I find the stuff on Gaterma, so it's like, all of these things are stacking. And then, I told Dan Dutton, when we were having a conversation, that, it's just so strange. There's a story of this place called Oakwood, and it is a mental health facility here in Somerset. And it was built in 1973. And it's all, I heard stories from everybody about Oakwood, tons of ghost stories, tons of weird stories. But, you expect that from a hospital, or, a place where, people work. And, it's just, people just tend to tell crazy stories, But so the place was built in 73. And at the time, it was the most experimental mental health facility in America. NBC's Nightline did a special on it when it opened in 73. This was like the Vietnam War was happening. The mental health industry in America was sort of in shambles. People were not receiving the care that they needed. And so all these newspaper articles are talking about this place opening up in Somerset. I later find out that it was actually supposed to open up in the desert out west. And so the buildings themselves were constructed to be built down into the earth because of high winds on the flat desert, right? But they didn't change that architectural design when they built it here, right? So the buildings are down into the ground. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the place from above, it is this super. Anybody that wants to get on Google Earth, look up Oakwood, Somerset, Kentucky, and you'll find this facility, and it looks like this weird occult symbol, like the place itself is laid out. Right. And it's all of these cottages. And so rather than having a single hospital where the patients were, they were in cottages, a number of cottages. And so right after it opened, 6 weeks after it opened, there was an anonymous letter that was sent to the governor of Kentucky, the head of state police, the mayor here in town, and the chief of police, alleging that there was, and this is in the newspaper. This is so crazy. I've also filed a FOIA to get these documents because they've never been unsealed. But this letter that we know the details of because the health commissioner of the state of Kentucky came to Oakwood to answer them point by point in the newspaper article. We know that this letter was mailed 6 weeks after it opened, alleging that there was a witch cult practicing magic at the facility in the tunnels that connected the cottages together, and that they were performing seances, magical rituals, and that they were burning symbols into the backs of the residents, right?
Jesus.
So I was like, what is this, right? And then we found this from, digging into the newspaper. I was looking for, ghost stories that involved Oakwood. I didn't think I was going to find this, So then I was like, oh man, what? It's exactly the same time that, it was 73 to 79, but this did all happen in 73, but there were allegations throughout the 70s, right at the time that these people are telling me there's a cult here in town, Katerma shows up, there are other people, other things, the whole list of things happening at this time. I'm like, shit, is this, what is this? So then I'm interviewing what, for all intents and purposes, Rod Zimmerman is the town historian. He's a radio DJ, been a radio DJ here for 30 years, but he runs a Facebook group that has 20,000 people, and people send photos in. So he has really mapped out the history of the town. Right. And so, for the first season, I interviewed him. I mean, he was an essential part of finding some of these documents, but I'm talking to him about it. And he's like, when they fired the guy that was running the place, there was a series of psychologists, and the head guy was cited. I found another article where he was cited because he wouldn't dress professionally. He wore a sari and all these beads in his beard, right? And so I'm like, is this some Esalen shit? You know what I mean? Like, is this some and so I find that article, and I'm telling Rod about this and how these guys, the state came in, they fired everybody. Mm-hmm. And he says, yeah, my stepfather he's like, that's how we ended up here. My stepfather replaced the director, and he became the director, right? Yeah. And so he's like, I've seen all the documents, and I had heard these rumors, and I didn't say anything to him, but I heard these rumors that, there's like 24 cottages. I forget the total number. Anyway, most of the cottages are for lower functioning residents, right? But one of the cottages was for ultra high functioning savants. And I'd heard that, and I thought that was really strange. And he starts talking about, well, there was this one cottage that had these savants. And so I was like, this is crazy, and he's telling me about all this stuff. So then we start digging deep into Oakwood because I'm like, this is just ultra strange. There are tons of lawsuits over the years against the place. I'm talking to Dan Dutton. I think I just talked to Marco about Oakwood. I think he and I had a conversation about it, and he mentioned the Oakwood King, right? And the idea of Pan or the Green Man, and the cycle of the Oakwood King. So I mentioned it to Dan, and Dan's like, and this is totally unprompted. A lot of these things they sort of came out of these conversations with people, and then suddenly someone would be like, "Oh, actually, I have a story about that," and then it would intersect in this just incredible way. And that's what becomes addictive about all of this. It's like having those moments, right?
Yep.
And it's like if there is something watching, it's like, gotcha right there, But so Dan's like, I've got an Oakwood story for you. And he says, in the 1970s, he was like, it was 79. He was like 19 or 20 years old, and he's this painter and sculptor, and so he knew some people that worked at Oakwood, and this girl who was interested in him wanted him to come paint with these special patients that she was taking care of. And she said, listen, they're different than everybody else. And she told him, and again, he starts to tell me this, and I'm like, oh God, he's going to tell me something really crazy, And he's like, she told me that they were savants that were inhabited by extra-dimensional intelligences that were trying to save humanity. And she wanted him to come meet them and paint with them. And he was like, and I was like, what kind of acid are you doing? Right? Because he's like, this is 1979. She's kind of a hippie. All these people that she hangs out with that work over there are hippies. He's like, it's bullshit. Right. And Dan's definitely not, someone who would, definitely buy into that. So he was like, he's about magic and mystery, but, not in that way. Mm-hmm. And so they try to get him to come. He doesn't want to do it because he thinks they're crazy. But finally, he acquiesces. They send a car for him. He goes over there. She's not there, but another woman that works with that particular cottage comes to meet him, takes him back there. And he says when he gets back there to that cottage, all of these people are in the grass in front of the cottage, eating popcorn out of the grass on their hands and knees like animals, right?
Right.
And he says, and Nathan, and as he's telling me this too, it's in the podcast, in the second season, I used the real audio from the conversation because I was interviewing about the Oakwood King, I didn't expect to catch this story, but his voice breaks. He's looking at me because so much of Dan's work involves memory and memory palaces. Right. And he prides himself on not forgetting things, right? Of creating these memory palaces. And his voice breaks and he's like, and Nathan, I can't remember what happened after that. He says, the next memory I have, thinking back to, he's like, I haven't thought back to that moment in 30 years, or 40 years. And he was like, you talked to me about this. He's like, I only remember them driving me back to my farm, to Dandyland. And he was like, I was there for 3 hours and I don't know what happened. And he said, but that day was one of the most important days in my life because when I got back to the farm, I received all of this inspiration that caused me to conceive the Stone Man, the Secret Commonwealth, all these major operas that he created. He said he sketched out this, what he calls the Omicron, that day.
Right.
And he was like, but I haven't thought about the fact that happened that day until now, So I've got Rod Zimmerman telling me that there are these savants, right? And multiple people. And Dan's telling me that he actually interacted with him. I'm like, this is fucking Stranger Things, and it's just like, how does that fit into this, And then it's like, that set into motion a series of things that involves Dan into a lot of this weirdness, right? And I don't know. I mean, it's like you've got Gaterma here. You've got people with those stories about the savants. We tracked the savants until 1982, and then they're gone. They're gone from Oakwood. But I have witnesses that worked with them, or and I finally, he wouldn't tell me who the woman was that initially contacted him, and I thought it was because I knew. He knew that I knew her and didn't want me to ask her. But I've since found out who it is. I haven't. He's asked me not to ask her about these things, but she listened to the podcast and she was very upset. At some of the stuff that come out. But I mean, like, well, how does that factor into all of this? I mean, like, that's such a strange thing, and for her it was alien. But you have these people in that same decade doing these rituals. You know what I'm saying? Like, does that connect to it? I don't know.
If you look at that, what you've just described, though, he's gone to meet these people. They're behaving in a very strange way, and he has a missing time experience, and he comes back and he's inspired, right? And it's like it's a very much a classic pattern. If you look at the fairy folklore, if you look at Jinn folklore, Jinn inspire poetry, fairies inspire music. Like there's a direct correlation and with just explosions of creativity and capability that come from these weird abductions, these weird occurrences, and and who knows how they happen or why. But I mean, like, from my world, from my world, looking at all this stuff, I'm like, that's an abduction, and he comes back creatively inspired. Like well, might be being a bit hyperbolic there, but
no. I mean, as you were saying it too, I was like, he's going to suggest this as fairies. I was like, I haven't thought about it. I'd sort of compartmentalized the fae experience with, in the fourth episode, Dan has that experience with Pan, the archetype of Pan, but in a way, why, there's nothing that says that experience isn't connected to that original experience in the sense that they've never finished with him. Yeah. You know what I mean? That they've been, that the Fae have sort of been a part of his life always,
100%. That, and it's multi-generational as well. Like there's definitely family ties to this stuff, but there's also ties of place, which is remarkable. And like, I don't want to get too het up on the kind of the geography and the geology of a place, but it's funny that because when I was listening through the show and you're kind of mentioning karst landscapes and stuff, I was like, what the fuck? Well, because it comes up again and again, like I did an interview with a lady called Dr. Maria Voivod, who's who's done a lot of research into kind of what she calls the fairy seers of Eastern Serbia. Now, there's no kind of there's no English translation for the actual term, but this is all located in a karst landscape, and she actually documents one of the fairy seers going into trance and singing down the fairies, her fairy sisters, which she then predicts the future for the community she lives in, and there's just, again, but it's like, but specifically she mentions this is a karst area, and it's just, you don't hear that a lot. People don't genuinely kind of volunteer the information. By the way, have I told you this is a karst landscape? It doesn't come up that often in conversation. It could be nothing. It could just be one of those things. But again, it's this absurdities that this the other tends to communicate in absurdities as well.
Well, you think about it too, that it's the karst landscapes are, Siberia also has a karst landscape. Think of all of there are tons of stories in Siberia of various things, lights, UFOs. You think of, meteor strikes, obviously, all these things. But the karst landscape, because of it being so pockmarked, and there's this idea of the flowing water, right? That's beneath everything, the caverns, the tunnels, the sort of subterranean element to all of it. And the court, definitely with the limestone or the sandstone that are part and parcel with the karst landscape. You have quartz, that's spread across the landscape. So I think that place is very much involved and I think this place, right, definitely in the show, I was trying to communicate to everybody that, hey, you should look at the magic and mystery of every place. It's wherever you are, like people are so like, oh, I live in the most boring place in the world. It's like, you know what? You should look at the place you live, because you're probably going to find something fantastical, right? Yeah. That relates to you even, But I will argue with anyone that this place, though, in particular, is because of the Kentucky anomaly and because of the quartz, because of the karst. Like, it's like this perfect coalescing of elements for like something like the attraction of a lot of things or the explosion of all of these things. But it's just so potent with mystery and magic. And I'm not even saying that in a figurative way, that literally, because of this specific place, it is generative of those things, Yeah.
It's definitely a confluence point of something. And I really want you to talk through to the Kentucky anomaly, right? Because that blew my fucking mind. That was like, I had to rewind using some old language for some of the young people listening. We have these things called tapes. I had to kind of go back and go, hang on, I need to listen to that again. Because that was absolutely insane.
Well, that's probably, another weird revelation, jaw dropping, where it's like, I was looking at, Sedona at the time. And, I've told this before, but, I was looking at that. All these people have all these UFO sightings there. And this was even before we moved to Somerset and we were living in Lexington. I went to Transylvania University, which at the time I went to Transylvania, I wasn't even, I was fascinated by all kinds of stories like this, but I really wasn't like focused on it, but I was studying philosophy there. And now I know that Transylvania has the only sample of the Kentucky meat shower, right? Like in its special collections. And I'm like, damn it! If I had known that at the time, I would have like tried to find that,
Yeah.
But we were living in Lexington, where Transy is located, and so I was looking up some stuff on Sedona and why people were having all of these. It was like the most at the time. It was like the most sightings in North America, Sedona, and I read about the quartz. There's a huge. I've since been able to travel to Sedona. I think Sedona is fantastic. It's so beautiful. Also, I just like the subculture of all the mystics and New Age people. It's just fascinating.
Sure.
But there's this massive, like for real, 2-mile vein of quartz that runs underneath Sedona, and you can actually see the quartz popping up out of the desert. There's pieces of rock, right? And so on top of that. I was reading this, the research was talking about the fact that there was a major geomagnetic anomaly. And so I was like, well, man, I can test that out, right? Like I can see if there are other places in America that have some of these qualities, and then maybe I can go to one. Because at the time I couldn't travel to Sedona, and I was wondering if the combination of, because I knew about the piezoelectric effect. So it was like, if you take quartz and hit it with a magnetic field, it'll produce energy, like electrical energy.
Right.
And I was really wondering, like, is it possible that these people are seeing all these things because, the combination of the quartz and the geomagnetism, intense geomagnetism, is affecting people's brains, causing them to see the phenomena, right? So I found a geomagnetic anomaly map. There are these KMZ files online you can drop them into Google Earth, and then it'll show you, the Eurosat, satellite images of that. So I did that and then started pulling other anomaly maps, and you can see that Southern Alaska, Sedona, and this spot in the southeastern United States, have these intense anomalies. And so I zoomed all the way in because I was like, here's one in the southeastern United States. I can drive down there. I can interview people. I can find out if they are also seeing these things. And sure enough, when you zoom all the way, it's Somerset, Kentucky, right? And so you start pulling these maps, right? And this is before the Pennyroyal mystery really even got started, that I knew this about this place. And then I end up marrying a girl from here and end up coming down here. Mm-hmm. But since then, I get all these maps, and you can look at these maps and see. And then there's tons of new research articles about this, that it is the highest spike of geomagnetic energy in the northern hemisphere. And then they even show a surface map where they have Sedona, they have Alaska, and this one is just gigantic. And it really is so significant that it causes the Van Allen belts to dip down. Right? It really is. Insane. So what I just found out, though, after the show came out, other people obviously got involved and did their own research.
Yeah.
There were some guys that were corresponding with a geologist who had surveyed Pulaski County. They were spelunkers and mountain climbers. They got in contact with him and were looking for the mine. We ended up going down in Gaterma's mine, right? Mm-hmm. The guy sends them the anomaly maps, right? The geomagnetic anomalies. And so the peak is, like, Pulaski County is on the peak, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you keep doing concentric circles outward, it's the center circle is Pulaski County. But inside that, there are two peaks. And one of the peaks is where the mine is. Like where all of this stuff, where all of these magical groups were going, is that spot. And it's like the most karst, part of the county. It's where the Sloan's Valley cave system, like all of these things are focused there. And then on top of it, the mine that we end up researching, the stories we find out about the bait cabal coming from Cincinnati and practicing these rituals there, Nema, and that's where the ritual site is. There's a structure that they built there that someone built, but I think it's bait cabal because it's called the beehive, and the symbol of the bait cabal was the bee and the vulture, right? And all of these people I've interviewed remember these people coming from Cincinnati and spending parts of the summer there naked, doing some strange things. And they were skyclad, and like, that was weird because, hearing old country folk talk about the weird devil worshippers and the weird people that were using this building that they didn't understand. And the building is structured as a ritual. The top of it telescopes open and there's a hearth in the center of it, right? Totally crazy. But it's like that all is centered. And it's like, did they know about the Kentucky anomaly or did they sense it? Or, is that what's drawing all of these people and all of these things? And since the show came out, I've found so many more people and so many more things that I can't explain it. We found 2 more Mr. X's, 2 other people that are involved in whole other networks of mysteries that are involve the nation, right? Involve like some of the biggest stories in conspiracy and in politics.
Yeah.
They're here. And I wouldn't have even found them, but people started sending me messages and started saying, have you looked at so-and-so? And I would have missed it. And I look and it's like a Pandora's box opens. And it's like another person, another series of stories, all just so strange and centering on this one area. And it's like, is it the anomaly? Is that what's drawing people? Is it the combination of all these things? I mean, I don't know. It's so fascinating. You know what I mean? Like, cause it's like, and also there are all these people seeing UFOs, all these people seeing Bigfoot, all these other things that are like, more common things, but it's like, that's all, how's that all connected to this,
Well, look, we've gone for a bit and it's been a real pleasure chatting to you. When's series 2 out?
Oh yeah. So, I was shooting for September, but we found all this extra stuff that I've kind of packed into it. So anyway, I announced the official date is January the 11th, 2022. So January the 11th, which also is sort of a significant number in the story, 111. So I was like, why not? Why not do it that day? So so 111 will be the release date. And definitely, if anybody's interested in following along with this stuff, we've got the Liminal Lodge is our Patreon. If you look up Pennyroyal on Patreon, you'll find it. But we've got a great group of people who've been sort of, following us through this whole thing, and they've seen everything happen every week. And so if anybody's interested in just like chasing down the mystery with us and kind of helping, I'm telling you, like a lot of stuff in the second season, I would have only found because people in the lodge were already digging into it. And then they were like, hey, did you find this? Did you see this? Because it's just too much stuff. Amazing. It really is, it's just too much stuff to go through. And so that was the whole intent of creating the group was that, people would find things that we weren't finding or hadn't seen. And that would help us figure out more of the mystery. And it absolutely has happened. So definitely check that out if anybody's interested.
Brilliant. Well, I'll leave all the links in the show notes. for that. Nathan, it's been a pleasure chatting to you. Really enjoyed this. And it's such a wonderful podcast you've created on such an array of levels. It really is. It's fucking great. And I say that as a fan, from an audience member and a podcaster as well, from both perspectives. So yeah, awesome.
You don't know how much I appreciate that. Seriously.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm glad. Well, thank you for fucking making an awesome show. Right. Everyone knows where to find you. We got the links in the show notes. Nathan, it's been awesome chatting to you.
You too, man. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Nathan. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. And really, what a remarkable story. It's a fantastic podcast. So if you're not familiar with it, do check it out in the show notes, and then go one further and become a patron and help support it for season 2. It's well worth it. And I'm really looking forward to season 2. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and talk soon. Bye.